Hello and welcome to Week 7 and Chapter 7 here in Introduction to Psychology. And I thought I would change gears a little bit. And when I'm teaching face-to-face classes, I don't actually go over the course book like that, but I create a slideshow and I lecture over that slideshow. So I'm going to try doing that just because we can. So ultimately, you're still required to read the textbook, read the course book, get all the information out of here. Let's use this video for me to replicate what I might do in my regular class using my slideshow software and kind of going over the concepts, the general concepts. Same sort of deal, covering the content within the course book, but getting a little bit more colorful and animated about that. So here we are, Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 is all about thinking and intelligence. Now, when we think about intelligence, using both of those terms in the same sentence, we often think about this guy. Einstein's name has become synonymous with intelligence. And here, of course, he has a nice quote, "The true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination." And that will lead us to a discussion about different ways in which we view intelligence. Now, the first one, when we think about Einstein and we think about intelligence, we often think about the concept of IQ, which I will get to, intelligence quotient. And right at the beginning of the course book, there's an opportunity to take an IQ test, an online. It's not a really valid test per se. It's one of those online ones you can play around with. But go ahead and take it anyway, and then I'm going to tell you how it's useful and how it's not useful. So please go ahead, take that test anyway, even though the field of psychology has moved beyond the simple IQ as the sole measure of intelligence. So, when we're talking about thinking intelligence, we're obviously talking about functions that happen in the brain, and we're in the world of what we call cognitive psychology, or understanding, thinking, intelligence, language, creativity, all the really cool stuff that our brain does. For the sake of this particular chapter, I'm going to be focusing on some concepts. The first one, of course, is metacognition. Metacognition is, in a sentence, when we think about thinking. It's the ability that we have to actually think about our own internal processes, evaluate them, determine whether they were effective or not, and then adapt. Now, this is a cognitive ability that develops over time when we're really young. We don't have a whole lot of different ways to approach problem solving or whatever, so we have some pretty straightforward mechanisms for doing that. But certainly, you might have experienced as you came into college, or maybe you're coming into college right now, you have a preference for taking classes face-to-face, and now you have to take them online, and you're basically looking at this task ahead of you called passing the Psych 101 class, and you're thinking, how am I going to approach this? That's it. That's metacognition. How am I going to do this? How am I going to schedule my time? How am I going to make sure that I know when things are due? How am I going to think about these things? What study methods am I going to do? What routines am I going to get into? All of that is the function of metacognition, that we kind of see the expert use of that as a hallmark of adulthood. It's the ability to approach situations from different perspectives and evaluate our own approaches and assumptions to that. So we look again at some more terms here. The notion of concept, and those notion and concept and idea, those all get mixed together, but there are some real ways in which we use these words in psychology. A concept is a internal representation. We're going to see another word for that coming up. Internal representation of an idea. We have prototypes of those ideas, at the current status of those ideas and how they are represented, and that of course changes over time in the development of what we call schema, or schemas, the plural. Now ultimately, we really want to use the word schemas to refer to the notion of internal representations of the external world. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about, right at the end, when we talk about the assignment. But essentially, we might think like, let's say I have a car. I have an internal representation of the car. There's a concept of the car, the general thing. There's the internal right now representation of that. And my schema describes everything that I know about a car. Now, it's that sum total. If somebody said, do a class on everything you know about cars, it would be a short class for me. But for an expert, an auto mechanic or an engineer or something like that, they could go on for days because their schema is extremely complex. And when this sort of refers in developmental psych, we talk about, very, very simple schemas developing over time. They are modified by assimilating information, by accommodating existing information to new facts, to the point that we become experts. And the content that we are experts on are the schemas within us that are incredibly complex. So we are schema experts. Now, there's another kind of schema that we have, and that's the event schema. And this has to do with long-term memory. It has to do with how we consolidate facts about an experience together, the process that we go about of changing those experiences. I mean, we have all experienced the idea of an individual who you go to an event and you're talking to your friend who was there, and you have two totally different stories about what happened. Now, that is because the schema process is an active construction of those events. We look at those events and we pick and choose, almost like an editor would take all the film clips and put it together to produce the final movie. If we actually saw everything going on, there's a lot more that never made it into the movie, right? We sometimes get a glimpse of that with the outtakes and the clips, and when people screw up their lines and whatever. That was all taken out for the final product. And memory of, autobiographical memory has that quality to it. We snip and cut. We'll get a little bit into that when we get into memory, but certainly when we look at event schemas, we pick and choose and we actively construct the memories that we have, and we can take things out, add things in. There's emotional qualities to it. There's all kinds of very rich experience, and we build that, and we kind of refer to that as event schemas, things that happen in our lives that we have internal representations of. Okay, now, one of the problems about our brains is that it has some built-in mechanisms that lead us to make some errors. And I put this breaking news, how many times have we seen this in the last, year? New ideas, new things coming out, and wonder, what is it with the news? And you look at the news and everything's like really dire and dim. And what does that mean? Why is now, the fact is, if you look up, and I have a little indication of that in the course book, if you look up the work of Steven Pinker, who is a psychologist at Harvard, if you look up his work, he tries to focus our eyes and our attention onto the fact that when we look at the world as a whole and we look at the world over time, we're actually improving over time. Things have gotten better over time. Now, it's not a linear process. It goes like this. So depending on where you are in an exact period of time, we might be on a down. So here's the pandemic. Here's political divide. Here's a conflict, a war, those are the down times. But in general, over history, the metrics that we use to measure prosperity and happiness and all that, people all over the world, and there's diversity, obviously, we tend to be going in a good direction. But what is it about the news always focusing on the negative? So not only do we get breaking news, we usually get breaking bad news, and I don't want to make any references to the TV show Breaking Bad, but we get bad news. What is it about bad news that it's always at the forefront of our news? And there is an answer to that, because bad news gets pulled out of the regular news, because one of the things that is about human beings is we have what we refer to as a negativity bias. Now here's the thing. If things are going well, think about this in terms of survival. If you want, let's put on the lens for a little bit of the evolutionary psychologists who think that a lot of these things came from evolutionary, more simple animals, simple representations of us. When things are going well, I don't have to pay attention to them. There's no motivation for me to take action. Like, the steak is done well. I don't need to take action on that. I hear no dangers coming into the cave. I don't have to take action. I can continue relaxing, hanging out, working on my cave drawings. However, we do have an attention-getting process that focuses on things that we perceive of as negative. I smell the steak burning. I hear a growling outside the cave. This focuses our attention on the things that need our attention. So if we imagine that in the modern world where we're not really, we can still worry about the burnt steak, but we're not really always worrying about the danger signals outside the cave, we can probably understand why we're attracted to bad news. Bad news makes the news. And so this presents us with a problem, because when the news is constantly putting forward the idea of the negative things going on, you see them doing, right at the end, they might, here's a humanitarian story trying to give us hope about the world. The thing is, most of what's going on in the world is like that. The negative things are actually, go see Steven Pinker, rare. That's why they make the news. Rare things they're new, rare. So rare things make the news. If it was the norm for all of these things to happen, why would we need to hear about it, right? So we have to understand, first, our tendency to go for news that's negative. The creators of those news agencies know that, and they present the news in that way to hold their viewership. And we have a tendency to not see the good. Okay. Now there's another concept that I want to get into. So we talk here about negativity bias, that is a constant error that we get because we are attracted to bad news because it's stuff we might have to react to. However, when we're surrounded by all this stuff that's going on, there's another process that happens. And I don't want to project this at any sort of cognitive laziness or not, but it's particularly in this generation when we are surrounded by so much information, so many sources of information, diversity of voices, all of that. The amount of time that we have in the day to process that in order to come to a good balanced conclusion is fairly limited, and we're in a information overload. Now, this has been going on before the modern age, but it's certainly much more present now that we have availability of all these different news sources. So what processes do we see cognitively when somebody's surrounded by that? Now, first off, we look to the media around us and we develop schemas about the world. Now, you can already throw in there, if we're looking at the news and developing schemas of the world, it's pretty easy to come to a conclusion that the world's going to hell. So that's logical. Doesn't mean it's correct, but it's certainly, as we're developing these schemas, these internal representations of the world, if we're using the news, there you go. Now, we go beyond that, however, and in sociology, we actually describe a process of the sociological imagination, of the social construction of reality. The sociological imagination is really it's a huge term that describes how you understand the way the world works. So this is beyond the individual schemas of how the world works, and it's the interconnectedness of all that. It's your place in it, what's going on in other places of the world, the government, your family, your partner, your pets, it's that whole grand scheme of how you understand the world. And of course, this representation, our sociological imagination, is what drives our decision making in terms of our actions in our society, jobs, how we approach our jobs, our honesty, ethics, political leanings, all of these things. Very, very important to understand where our sociological imagination comes from, the collection of all these schemas that we have in the world, which are primarily bad and not necessarily representative of what's really going on. However, in addition to things being bad, when we look at these sources of information, we are developing heuristics. Now, we're exposed to bad things. So we're developing an internal representation that the world is a bad place, even though statistics tell us that in the long range, not that bad things aren't going on and not that we don't have to address them, but the world is essentially going in a good direction. The long game is going well. Heuristics is the process of thinking, of developing those things. So we know that if we're relying on the news, there's a negativity bias. So the negativity affects our heuristics. We are going to look for things to validate that. If we think the government is corrupt, we have so much information available to us to confirm that. Whether it's true or not, we can easily find that information in front of us. And so when we look at this negativity bias and we look at the availability of different sources of information around us, this leads to, and I used the word already, availability heuristics. Now this is an error in our thinking. Just like negativity bias is an error in our thinking, we tend to be focused on that. We need to realize that we focus on bad news because it's what we have to respond to. It makes sense in a way. Availability heuristics is what's close to us. What's the easiest information to find? It's not cognitive laziness, but in order to come to the real story, we'd probably have to do more than a simple glance onto Facebook. Facebook is a very, very powerful platform because it is immediately available. There are very, very strong psychological reasons why people become hooked or addicted to Facebook. The immediacy of those interactions. And let's throw negativity bias in there. When we are actively constructing our understanding of the world, developing schemas about that, developing our sociological imagination, we have a tendency to look at the negative. We go on to Facebook and it's right there coming at us right now, and we're going to try and reinforce and find information to validate our internal schemas. And then we get caught into this idea of like, okay, if I go on to Facebook or I go into any media channel and I have a issue about something, I will find support, I will find likes, I will find like-minded people, I will do all that, and it's very self-validating. And if anybody's ever heard of the question, the story of the emperor's clothes, it's a king that's going mad, and eventually he has no clothes on, but nobody's willing to call him out on it because he's the king. Right? But if we surround ourselves either virtually or physically with people who are just going to validate our point of view, our point of view is going to be significantly flawed by our negativity bias and our availability heuristics. And human beings are also pretty unwilling, it's really reluctant to give up those particular heuristics because they've developed a social circle around them, they've developed a sense of culture. How many of us want to go, hey, my understanding of the world is wrong, it's been wrong for years? How easy is that to do? And yet here in this class, in my sociological class, that's exactly what we would like you to do. We'd like you to question your worldview, because all of us are subject, until we learn about it and take action on it, we're all subject to negativity bias and availability heuristics. So that nice little lecture there on that. So let's move on We're going to take a look at intelligence now. That was a little bit about thinking. Let's return to Einstein, one of my favorite characters in history, and let's talk about this IQ thing that we have going on. Now, I asked you to take that IQ test, but that IQ test rests within a culture within psychology about individual differences. Now, the world of psychology has always been what makes people different, not just what makes them tick, but why do you tick a certain way and I don't tick that way? I'm trying to understand that mostly in the history focusing on either pure science, what makes an eye blink, those kinds of things, and mental illness, what makes, that person's not ticking right. That kind of analysis. But individual differences has long been the focus of psychology. Why are we all different? Why do we don't all build the same houses? We don't have instincts. We're unpredictable. Unlike much of the rest of the natural world, we're incredibly unpredictable. So we look at individual difference. We want to measure those because we want to be a scientist and we want to measure those things. Don't want to just use words that are difficult to understand. We engage in testing of all kinds in order to gather the data that we use in measurement. And that entire field of psychology is called psychometrics. So that's a field that's a division of psychology, not a division like of the APA, but psychometrics is the use of testing, measuring in order to better understand human behavior. The individual, Dr. John Bridge, who has passed away several years ago, was the individual who got me interested in psychology. Is actually the mentor that I had at the first college I went to. I was going for marine biology, and then he convinced me to try his classes, and I got the bug. He was a psychometrician. He studied the process of using measures to, he didn't just use them, he actually studied how effective they are, how valid they are. He was a principal in developing tests, paper and pencil tests that would accurately diagnose mental disorders. So let's actually talk about that. In the recent past, there was a big hubbub that came out about when then President Trump took a cognitive assessment and then reported that he had scored way above that. His practitioners were like, wow, you're amazing and all that stuff. And the truth is, the underlying reality of that is the cognitive assessment that he was given was the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Now that is a basic test of cognitive abilities that is used as a first point data for the diagnosis of mental disorders like dementia and Alzheimer's. This is a test that, unless you have dementia and or Alzheimer's, you would score very well on this test. It is a paper pencil test that has people draw things, identify objects, remember words, and those kinds of things that actually, if we have the kind of damage that is related to dementia and Alzheimer's, we would have a difficult time doing. That test is the product of psychometrics. Can we create a test that has somebody doing something, and the way they do that, the errors they make or their accuracy, determines whether or not they have physical, chemical, or some sort of biological damage to their brain? Wasn't a really big feat of intelligence for President Trump to actually do well, and it really represents not so much bravado, but a misunderstanding of that test. It's not an intelligence test. It's actually a test for Alzheimer's. I don't know why he was taking it. I don't know why somebody was administering that to him. That's a mystery. Okay, so let's get back to, we're looking at psychometrics, and what is it about this IQ thing? Let's take a look at that. And what IQ is, it stands for intelligence quotient. And in the testing world, let's go way back to Alfred Binet in France was asked to create tests to give to children to determine which kids would benefit from special education versus which kids should go into regular school. We have to see that origin as pretty much the limit of the utility of the IQ. And the intelligence quotient, which is a fraction, determines, he created a test that basically determined what does your 3-year-old, what can your 3-year-old do? What can your 4-year-old do? Right down to like the 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 years old. You know, that kind of, very granular. You take he standardized that test, testing hundreds and hundreds of kids to determine what the average was. So let's say you take a test at 4. You're 4 years old and you take the test, but you score like the average 5-year-old. That means you have a higher mental age than your chronological age. Now, the math of that is if you have a 4-year-old intelligence and you are 4 years old, if you perform like the average 4-year-old and then you are 4 years old, then you have a 4-year-old mental intelligence over a 4-year-old chronological intelligence. 4 over 4 is 1 times 100. You have a score of 100, which is the average intelligence of all ages. If you think 15, 15, 25, 25, all across the board. If you score significantly below or significantly above, you are brighter than the average 4-year-old, you perform better on that test, or you're not as bright as the average 4-year-old and you perform lower. And he developed lines in the sand, and that they were basically 70 if your mental age is below your chronological age, and the fraction is 0.7, the ratio between those times 100, giving you an IQ of 70. That was the line for what they called at that time mental retardation. 120, which is higher mental age over chronological age, was the line in the sand when they said gifted, intelligent, genius. And genius is sort of like it's moved on from there, 150, 160. But those measures. Now, these are all based on comparing your scores to other people. Okay? So if there was a spaceship that passed over Earth and they beamed the Earth and everybody's intelligence all went up together, your IQ wouldn't change because it's in relation to peers. So everybody your age would get intelligence too. So you would still be at intelligence of 100 or 120 or 98 or wherever you are. We have to understand that this particular test, keep in mind its origins, it all has to do with performance in school. There are lots of other intelligences that we have, and we'll be getting to that shortly. So review, here we have mental age over chronological age. If you're a 9-year-old on the bottom, performing like a 10-year-old, 10 over 9 times 100 is 111, and that would be your IQ. You would have a tendency to perform better in the kind of things that IQ tests measure, such as scholastic ability. Many of you have taken an IQ test either as a part of your schooling or whatever, or you took that SAT thing. The SAT is an intelligence test. It doesn't score the same way, and we don't use the grades the same way, but it tests the same things. It tests the likelihood that you're going to do well in school. And the degree to which it can predict that is the degree to which colleges use that score for acceptance or scholarships or whatever they would have. A high SAT score means unless you drink too much or just party or whatever, you probably find the school stuff easy, if you have a high SAT score. Whereas if you have a low SAT score, you might be needing tutoring services or time management help or things like that. Okay, now, we know that that's a pretty limited view of intelligence, so I want to introduce you to two contemporary researchers who are working on another way to view intelligence. The first is Robert Sternberg, who I actually shook his hand. It was actually really cool. Went to the Association of American Colleges and Universities conference in Boston, Massachusetts. Didn't even know this was happening. He's actually sort of a hero of mine. and he was the keynote speaker, and I made my way up to the front so I could just shake his hand and thank him for his work. Very, very, very cool guy, very funny, very, very interesting. Read up on him. He's doing some great stuff even now. And then there's Howard Gardner at Harvard University, and I was in Cambridge one time, and I snuck onto the campus of Harvard, found his office, and he wasn't there. So didn't get to meet him. These are real people. They're doing real work. These two, of course, are at the end of their careers, but they're still publishing. Robert Sternberg is actually took on a presidency of a small college out west, and Howard Gardner is still doing work, as far as I know, at Harvard, and he has several organizations to promote his ideas. Let's get back to what they said, though. Here we have Robert Sternberg and Howard Gardner representing the new wave in psychology that we call multiple intelligence. So we'll take a look at each one. Here we have Howard Gardner, and Howard Gardner introduced the triarchic theory of intelligence. I mean, there's three kinds of intelligence, or actually three applications of intelligence. We have at the top here this triangle, and this is not like the most important, it's just looking at graphically here. We have analytical intelligence, which is very much like an IQ. You could probably measure this with an IQ. This is mental steps or components used to solve problems. It's kind of basically IQ. Then we have over to the bottom right here, practical intelligence, and this is the ability to read and adapt to everyday life, flexibility. And then finally over here on creative intelligence, this is where we get experience. And you see this practical and creative intelligence is coming in here as very vital parts of what we would actually wish to think about when we think about intelligent people. You know, we have book smarts up there, but can you apply it in the real world? And when the real world is changing, can you adapt creatively? Now, what we ultimately want is all three. If you've ever had a mentor, and I have had mentors, I view them as being off the charts on all of these. John Bridge was an incredibly intelligent scientist. He was also a very practical, hands-on, able to read the situation, even in fields outside of psychology. And he was incredibly creative. I knew him outside of the college. We played on the same Frisbee team. That's the kind of place I was living. We played on the same Frisbee team. That's where we met. And his sense of humor and his joking around and just his general personality. To tell you the truth, it's what I try to emulate myself. He was very formative part of my life. And so he had all of this. He had all this going. And so this is another way to look at intelligence that is not necessarily well measured on IQ tests. Next, we have Howard Gardner. Now, Howard Gardner introduced a series of types of intelligence, almost like different skill sets that we have. But what it does, rather than look, the triarchic theory looks at applications, and how we make it through life. What Howard Gardner came along and said, there are people that have really, really high and conversely really low intelligences in specific areas, and they may seem like giftedness. They appear as giftedness or deficits in that particular person's personality that may or may not generalize to other areas in their intelligence. It's really important to recognize that they're isolated from one another, each one of these types of intelligence. So his theory puts out all of these: spatial intelligence, being able to move around, people who are good with directions. They drive someplace once and they can always find that place. Naturalists, understanding the natural world and the interconnectedness of things. Musical intelligence, all of that. Just musical ability, but also the ability to pick up songs, remember lyrics and stuff like that. They have logical, mathematical intelligence, existential intelligence. That's kind of a new one in here. Being able to think in very broad terms. Interpersonal intelligence, the ability to really be a good listener, and this is very akin to emotional intelligence in terms of the understanding others. body kinesthetics, people that are good with their bodies, good dancers, athletes, some musicians, if they have a combination of body kinesthetics and musical intelligence. Linguistics, people who are good speakers, people who are good writers, understand. And intrapersonal, meaning an understanding of yourself, not, and that's the other half of emotional intelligence. You see, intra and interpersonal are both part of what another concept that we call emotional intelligence. So that brings us to the end of our chapter. I hope that you've enjoyed my slideshow. This was fun to put together with all these graphics. I love doing this artistic stuff anyway. I think there's an art one in there too. There's an art intelligence. Maybe I skipped it. You can look at the graphic. It's in your course book. So let's take a look at what I'm expecting you to do. There's two assessments and there's two discussions in a quiz. The first discussion asks you to look at negativity bias and your availability heuristics. These are very important things for you to become aware of. We are all in the same boat here. These are natural human tendencies. They steer us wrong when we let them steer us wrong. And so I think part of that process is determining, what am I going to put my energies into? What am I going to make effort to make sure that I'm not doing this? Important things. There's all kinds of things about, whether or not a TV show is good, or, there's stuff that we may not put on to that. I need to make an extra effort list, but important things we should. And let's start with the discussion of revealing our own, that I have a bias this way, and conversely, understanding that it may be wrong and holding on to it may lead you to a misunderstanding about how the world works, and ultimately poor decisions on however you enact yourself in the world. So we're going to have a discussion about that. Then we're going to have a discussion where you go and take that actual IQ test, talk about whether you think it's valid, talk about, what does it mean to you to have that particular score, keeping in mind that even psychology itself does not look at that score as a determining trait of you. It is simply a measure of how well you'll do in school, and hard work is not measured in it. So someone they could score low on an IQ test and still do phenomenally. And there's also people who can score very high on IQ tests and flunk out of school. So it's a relatively good predictor, but of course it's not 100% because human beings defy prediction. And finally, there's a quiz on that kind of have to do with creativity, where I want you to take one of the words that I've given you, and I want you to just pick the one that you think you can do this with, and come up with the most complex description of that you possibly can. Now, the example that I use is an apple. So, and I'm not going to do this but think of all the ways that we think about an apple. I'm surrounded, because I'm an Apple user, I'm surrounded by Apple computers. Someone can be the apple of my eye. The New York City is called the Big Apple. Right down the road from where I live is a store called the Big Apple. Apples are these fruit. Apple is a flavor. All of these different ways that we can take the word apple and increase its complexity, let alone if I was an apple farmer, let's say I had apple trees, imagine what I could say about apples. Or if I was a biochemist and I understood how apples produce sweet flavor, and that it's a fruit because the seeds are in the inside, and how they grow, and different temperate locations. It could go on, right? So pick a word and give me the most diverse view of that. And this is a creative endeavor because I want you to come up with, all these different ways of doing it. Off the top of your head, there's no wrong answers, right? I don't want you to look things up. Well, I guess you can look things up. You can become an expert in something. If I had to do this, I'd probably look up all the definitions of apple. I'd find all kinds, Garden of Eden. It would go on and on about all the ways in which the term apple is used. So that's our chapter for this week, chapter 7. And I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you enjoyed the chapter, and I will see you in the discussion boards.